Okay, hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the fifth or sixth my virtual Jericho every Wednesday at 5 o'clock. You don't have to go very far, you just have to be in your sitting room and on your laptop and tune in. This week, Tim Boswell, who's the manager. What's your title, Tim, at BBC Oxford?
Managing editor, manager, answer to most things, to be honest, John.
Of Radio Oxford.
Of Radio Oxford, that's right, yeah.
What do you do? What's your job?
Running the station, simply. An old colleague put being a radio editor down to two things in summary, and I've never managed to better actually, which is look after the people and you look after the programs. On paper, it's as simple as that.
How did you get there?
Via a very long and tortuous route, which you won't find in any kind of career manual, really, or indeed career guidance at school or college or any sort of university. So I left school not quite knowing what I wanted to do. I thought it involved pressing buttons behind a glass panel in a radio studio, maybe, or a TV gallery. And so I went to my then local radio station. I went to school in Worcester. Which was BBC Hereford and Worcester, and I applied actually for lots and lots of different places, and I was getting rejected for university courses on the grounds of my predicted grades, and as it turned out, my actual grades. And they were all saying one common theme was go and get some experience and apply next year. So I thought, okay, well, I'll take a year out, I'll get as much experience as I can, and I'll reapply. And so in the January, as it turned out, after I left school in June, I ended up at Hereford and Worcester on 2 weeks work experience. And to cut a very long story short, I never left. So I spent 3 really happy years there, working my way through T-Boy to eventually getting a taste of what it's like to present on the radio, which was a bit of a dream come true.
What did you do in those 2 weeks to impress them?
I was free. And it's funny how the hands that fate deals you, isn't it? That on my very last day, so it's 2 weeks, on the very last day of the Friday, the phone answerer for the mid-morning show presented by a guy called Mike George was ill, and I'd been working with that program at various points of that 2 weeks work experience. And I can't remember who it was at the time. I think it was a lady called Di Thomas who did HR, who said, well, you've been working with the program, you know how it works, just answer the phones and put them through to Mike in the studio. So at that point, Mike, I always remember say, he used to gauge his success on how few songs he played in those 2 hours, and how many callers he got. So it was just a case of just keep putting the callers through, and I think he played maybe one song right at the very end. And I think at that point I thought, oh, maybe I did an okay job. There's a lot of working for free that followed that.
So on the Friday, they said come back on Monday, did they?
I can't honestly remember. I think I left saying, look, I've really enjoyed it. I hope I've done a decent job. If you ever want anything doing, including working for free, I'll come back. I'm not sure it was the Monday, but it wasn't all that long after, a week or two after, they said, do you want to come back and do this? And then it was just about taking whatever opportunities were there. And even if that meant working all hours of the day or night or many days in a row or Christmas or bank holidays or whatever it was and whatever needed doing, just saying yes to everything.
If there was a door open, you kicked it and made sure it went open, did you?
Yeah, completely. And I think the other part was just learning to do everything. And I just wanted that point to become as indispensable as I possibly could. And some things never change. Even then, BBC budgets were under a fair bit of scrutiny, and several times there was mention that, look, we can't afford to keep giving you all this work that we're giving you. It's like, yeah, fine, I'll learn how to do this. I'll learn how to operate the desk. I'll learn how to operate the radio car, learn how all the kit in the newsroom works. And obviously it was all analog back at that point. So there was a lot more analog stuff around in the newsroom. And my first full-time job when I eventually got it was, the job doesn't really exist anymore because it's not needed, but it was called a radio production assistant, RPA, in the newsroom. And the job was, you stocked up the paper in the telex machine, and you made sure the fax machine was never out of paper, and you answered the news editor's post and opened it and presented it on his desk every day, and he would then give it you back with things to do with it. So it's very much an admin job, but as a way of learning how a newsroom worked back then, and to the point how it works now as well, actually, it was never bettered.
You didn't go to university?
I didn't, no, because at that point, by the summer of that year, and again, it's really difficult to remember the timescale, the work was so regular that at some point in that summer must have come a point of, right, do I want to apply again? Or must have even become before the summer. Do I want to apply again, or do I want to just dedicate everything that I've got to trying to crack this and get a job? And I don't know what point it came, or whether there was a moment that said, right, what am I going to do? Or whether I just went with it, but it just felt right the way it was going, that I wanted to work at that point rather than study, still fresh out of school at that point as well. And so I knew I was determined to work as hard as I can and take all the opportunities that were available to try and make it instead of going to university.
Any regrets about that? Do you wish you'd gone?
No, none whatsoever.
Really?
In short, no, I really don't, because I at 21, I got to think what year it was by the time I was 21, so it would have been 95, 96, yeah. So by the time I'd have been out of university, I was established kind of in the radio industry. I was about to move to my first full-time show on a commercial station and to do into a junior reporter role. And I don't think any amount of time in university would have got me to that point. So I felt ahead of the curve. I suppose now is about the only time that I've started thinking again about academia. And just at the point that coronavirus struck, I was about to start a master's degree with Cranfield University through a BBC apprenticeship, actually.
Right.
And funny enough, I was just looking on my calendar downstairs, and the first 3-day residential block of that would have been this week. Postponed, obviously, for obvious reasons, but at some point that I'll get back up and running again. So I'm looking forward to it. But that's the first point, 20 odd years on, that I've thought, okay, let's maybe explore academia again. But actually being hands-on, working for a living, working really hard is what's always motivated me.
Well, so it's 3 years in Hereford and Worcester, working all the way up to being a presenter, and then.
Yeah, I was getting cover presenter. So I think the first proper show that I presented was the Sunday afternoon rock show, which was fine because it kind of suited my taste in music at that point, and indeed now. A great grounding working with some amazing people. So the presenter that I answered the phones for on the breakfast show was Jane Garvey, who went on to some quite good things, I think it's fair to say. And before her, so I think he did 5 till 7 in the morning, and Jane did 7 till 9 or 7 till 10. Was Ben Cooper, latterly the controller of Radio 1. So got to work with some amazing people. Got the taste that I wanted to present, and at that point, probably with the managers that I was working with, sometimes it's about whether they like you as an on-air personality and like your voice or not. And the feedback I had from my then editor was, "Nah, you'll never work in radio, not with a voice like that." I think at that point, I thought, right, okay, I'm going to try and prove you wrong then, in which case, and worked really hard on my voice, but it was very difficult to get regular presentation cover work. So I thought I'd look elsewhere for it. And by coincidence, at that point, there was a license being advertised. This was late 95, early 96, a new commercial radio license being advertised. So a lot of smaller scale ones being advertised at that point, and it covered Stratford upon Avon in Warwickshire, into Evesham in Worcestershire, and into the North Cotswolds. So I tracked that application process through. No internet at this point, of course. So there was a radio industry weekly called the Radio Magazine, and followed the progress through that to the point where the successful applicant was announced, and wrote to them. Didn't hear back. I thought I'll blow my chance. Just phoned them on the off chance they hadn't received it. Posted the demo back again, and was invited not long after to meet the launch managing editor of the station, a guy called Roger Price. Who's now working for the BBC, actually, in Gloucestershire as an engineer, and sat on some storage cupboards in a clapped out old building on the outskirts of Stratford, an old guardhouse, an old ordnance depot, and had a chat. And he pretty much offered me the job there and then, and took a pay cut, and forgave a day off a week to go and do a 5-hour evening show there, Monday to Friday, 7 till midnight. I did Sunday breakfast, which was 6 till 10 on a Sunday morning. And was the junior reporter, so was working during the afternoon, doing interviews, finding stories for our evening news program. So joined the launch team there in 96.
Being a commercial radio station, you had no producers, just you.
Just me, that's right. And the team was 8 at launch, which covered all of the presenters, the boss, the guy who did the music, the guy who scheduled the ads, and crucially, being commercial radio, the 2 people who went out and sold the advertising as well. So we worked incredibly hard, but as a really tight team, and the station was profitable from day one, and drew a really big audience from day one as well. It was incredibly popular in the area that served at that point.
What were you doing the BBC wasn't doing that made it popular, do you think?
I think we were more local than the BBC could be at that point. Now, I suppose if you think we were covering bits of an area that was covered by, well, WM at the time, actually, because CWR had bitten the dust at that point. It was back to being shared. So there was probably something in that, and that bit of Warwickshire looking to within itself, if you like. Hereford and Worcester for Evesham and the Vale of Evesham, and Morton Marsh, Chipping Campden, the North Cotswolds covered by Radio Gloucester. So it was a very unique area in the fact that it could identify with itself, but it wasn't within county boundaries, and I think that that's kind of still the case now, really. I think we could be more local, and we were less. I don't know. We were free to do things. I always remember back to the floods of '98, where we knew something was going on because the traffic outside our building, when Stratford-upon-Avon and most of the Avon Valley flooded, it was Good Friday. We looked out the door and we could see that the traffic was bad, and in fact we knew we needed to go more, and we stayed live and local all night, I think overnight as well, and through the weekend, where at that point, for whatever reason, the BBC didn't have the flexibility to be able to say, actually, this is what's going on, we need to be there, and we need to be involved in this story and be helping people.
It's quite a philosophical question, but what is local radio?
I think it's many things. It's companionship, and I think that's where radio will always endure against the streaming services of this world. Yes, I can say a keyword and a speaker over there, so I won't say it. Will play whatever song I want it to. What it won't give to me is say, how was your day? Or it won't tell me about its day, or it won't tell me about a thing that it saw down my street that I also saw and recognize and can identify. And it won't bring me new characters from down the street or around the corner or the next town or the next village or the city up the road. And so I always come back to that one-to-one relationship, which is the enduring appeal of radio. I think is what radio gives. And when we're talking to new presenters, it's pretty much the first thing I'll say is that do what you want in terms of bring a photo in, bring a teddy bear in, whatever it is, but talk to one person both on air and obviously into the microphone, or talk to the clock, or talk to the microphone, or talk to the waggly meters that show how loud your voice is. But talk to one thing, talk to one person in your language as well. So if you're talking to you, I wouldn't ever say all of you, all of your calls, for example. I would say, thank you, how are you today? And that one-to-one relationship, to answer your question. So radio to me is companionship all the way.
So is that the secret of broadcasting? You have somebody in your mind and you talk to them?
Yeah, often the case, yeah. Is that, some stations have developed their own kind of listener with a face. I can't say I've ever had that face in mind or anybody's particular face, because I think once you've got into the habit of talking to that one person, as I say, it's just that the subtlety of your language, which in its own way changes the way you talk. If I was standing in front of on a plinth right now in front of a huge crowd, could you imagine such a thing, of hundreds or thousands of people, you would address a big crowd. If you're just talking to one person on the phone, or especially face to face, you talk differently. And so learning to talk face to face with one person feels very different to addressing a crowd. But I think that's the trick to it. So I think that's the trick to connecting with an audience. And I think some of the best radio presenters that you think of have always done that. And Terry Wogan's last words on Radio 2, I'm going to paraphrase ever so slightly and get it wrong. So hands up if I have. But what he said was, "Thank you for being my friend." Thank you.
Now you get loads of letters.
Being my friend.
Loads of letters from wannabes of all descriptions. What do you advise them? How do they become a radio presenter or a radio producer?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is that we get fewer letters now than, say, when I first started running programming for that commercial station, late 90s, early 2000s. I think there are ways for people, if your driving force in wanting to be a radio presenter is to become famous, or might have been in the early 2000s or late 90s, there are loads of other different ways to make yourself famous. So the mailbox is less full than it might have been 20 years ago. But for those that do come through, I really just, I suppose, go back to my own experience of learn everything, make yourself indispensable, listen to the greatest presenters, and actually listen to the worst presenters, because you've got to find your own style. And at the same time, I was trying to get work at Hereford and Worcester. I was doing hospital radio in Redditch in Worcestershire at the Alexandra Hospital. There was no one listening. Half the beds didn't even have a headset, and those that did didn't work. It almost, and at the time, it was it a bit soul destroying? I'm not sure actually, because I met some really interesting people, and some of them got into radio, and some of them didn't. And one guy I worked with, I gave a job to in radio later on down the line. But it almost didn't matter, because what you're doing is practicing being in a soundproof box. Back to what I was talking about, talking to a microphone, talking to a clock, talking to a picture of your friend, whatever, or your family, or whatever it might be. So that the practice there was so important of just get used to talking in that way, and find your own voice. I think that's what I was doing there. So went through lots of kind of different incarnations of me, if you like. Do I want to try and be Kenny Everett, or do I want to try and be Tony Blackburn, or do I want to try and be, I don't know, who would have been around at the time, Simon Mayo, or whatever it might have been. And actually, what you've got to be is you.
Who are your radio heroes now and then?
I think the great communicators, so the people who just get the medium right and do all of those things I've just talked about. But it's beyond doing that. It's, those are the basics of talking to one person, but being able to do that and more on top. So mentioned Kenny Everett, and I just remember listening to him on Radio 1. I guess it must have been when I was growing up, and hearing all kind of different sounds and things and being intrigued by that. Tony Blackburn would have been kind of a first memory, and playing, I don't know if you can see there's a drum kit there, but playing my mum's saucepans along to Tony Blackburn's weekend breakfast show on Radio 1. And I suppose in latter times, Chris Moyles, I've been a really big fan of. He's absolute Marmite. You love it or you hate it.
Yeah, he sounds in interesting ways, didn't he? Lots of pre-production.
Yeah, if you look at how much he loves radio, studies radio, and is a master of the craft. And again, bookshelf behind me, 2 of his books, which aren't the greatest literary works ever, but actually they show off a real love of radio. And I think if you project that forward, if you look at Radio 1 Breakfast now, and Greg James is the same. He was a radio practitioner before he became a celebrity. I'm not saying no celebrities ever work on the radio at all, because people do like hearing voices that they know. But actually, I think some of the best broadcasters are brilliant radio practitioners first, and it's being great on the radio then that have made them famous.
So what has Greg James done apart from being Alan Rusbridge's son-in-law? What was his background?
He was he was found by Radio 1 within student radio, I think. So in the last 5-10 years or so, Radio 1 have had a very close relationship with the Student Radio Association. And Student Radio Awards have been a happy hunting ground, I think for Radio 1. So I think he was found as a presenter of the year or some sort of award winner. I think was invited to go and demo, and things kind of blossomed from there. I think if you listen to his show, and he makes no secret of it, all the interviews that he did around starting Radio 1 Breakfast, he said, I'm going to put the audience first. And if you think back to who was immediate before him, Nick Grimshaw, and I understand the thinking, it was, okay, our younger audience identify with celebs, and Nick Grimshaw is here, who's someone who's got all the A-list celebs on speed dial on his phone.
I was at a party last night till 4 a.m. and all that. Yeah.
And that now, did that work for a breakfast audience? I mean, the figures were okay, but not amazing. Greg James, when he came in, said, I'm going to put the audience at the heart of everything we do. And if you look now at the TV ads to promote Greg James on Radio 1 or any of the promotion, he will always say it's something like Greg, the music and you, or something like that, that the audience is absolutely part of it, involved in some way, shape or form. It sounds daft, doesn't it? Because that should be the case on every radio show, but not necessarily sure it is.
Now, the factual presenters, who are your current and past favourites?
I'll put my hand up and say factual is not necessarily a genre of radio that I've necessarily plumbed to any great depths. I've always been drawn to radio that entertains more than informs. And that might come as a surprise, I suppose, to someone who's programming part factual radio and part entertainment radio. So leave that one with me, John. I'll come back and have a think.
You start your day with the Today programme then?
My own experience, and I'll be completely honest, my most regular experience of the Today program was when I was, I think, between 8 and 11 years old, and shared a lift with someone who lived 3 or 4 miles up the road into school. I was going to school in Warwick at the time, and I think his parents always used to drive us there, and my parents used to drive us back. It was always Radio 2 on the way back and Radio 4 on the way in. So in the Brian Redhead era of the Today program, that was kind of my first experience, and certainly my most regular. I think in interviewing terms, it's probably a little bit of a cliche, but I think it's difficult to look beyond John Humphreys of the sense of I'm going to listen to you, guest, MP, Prime Minister, whoever it might be. I'm going to react to everything that you say, and I think that art of the interviewer in not letting them off the hook, giving them enough space to make their point, but to be the most robust interviewer that you possibly can, I think is an absolute masterclass.
What makes Eddie Mair so great, for example?
I think it's the ability to be able to combine warmth, personality, and still be as sharp as a knife, both in comment and in interviewing technique as well, and in just the wry look at how the world is. And not to make a big thing of it. Not, I'm going to make a sharp comment now. Stand by. Here comes a sharp comment. Just doing it. It's a heck of a skill. And to be, do you remember dear old Les Dawson being able to play the piano badly? the trick, I think, is to do something subtly. You've got to be so brilliant at doing it. Of course, Les Dawson was a brilliant pianist, but me watching that growing up thought, oh, he's terrible. I could do that, but of course you can't. You've got to be so skilled. I'm not saying Eddie Mair is a bad interviewer in the slightest. What I'm saying is to be able to do that so subtly as he does, you've got to be an absolute master practitioner at it.
If Tony Hall were to give you lots of money and say, choose your top 5 for Radio Oxford, who would you choose?
Goodness me.
All your current presenters, aren't you?
I'm going to keep all my current presenters on the grounds.
They got killed in a plane crash.
Oh my goodness. I think I would go with, so complete Radio Oxford lineup accepted. I would be giving Jane Garvey a call. Yeah, it's difficult not to go back to the people that you work with all along. And I haven't spoken to Jane since the early 90s when she left Hereford and Worcester. But again, I know in that being able to communicate with warmth and absolute razor sharpness, I'd be bringing Jane into my lineup. How many have I got? 5.
The combination of her and Peter, what's his name, was superb, wasn't it, on 5 Live?
Peter Allen, yeah, absolutely. I must confess, the current dry pairing on 5 Live, I mean, I'm enjoying as well. Actually, there's a warmth to them, even amongst these COVID times. I think there's a real warmth there too.
Who are they? Said he ignorantly. Who are they?
It is one of them is about to come one of our new voiceovers for Radio Oxford, so I really should remember the names off the top of my head. It'll come to me in a moment. I'll go back to my top 5 and it'll come to me. So I would, who else are we? Alive or Dead, is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna make sure I jot these down. So I've got Jane on board, I've got Kenny Everett on board, as kind of already mentioned. I think for reasons of growing up with it's a bit like the Doctor Who that you grew up with, the Radio 1 breakfast presenter who you grew up with. I grew up with quite a few of them actually, but simply because I was reading a bit about his Radio 1 breakfast show, I'd bring Simon and Mayo in. So I'd be on the phone to Scala. I'd be talking to Chris Moyles. By the way, this isn't anyone for their love and knowledge of Oxford, by the way. This is my dream fantasy radio station, wherever it might be. I've got one more, haven't I? I've got Jane, I've got Kenny Everett, I've got Simon Mayo, Chris Moyles. Who else am I going for? One name that sprang to mind actually was, and again, here's a cliche that growing up, my kind of love of radio was forged without me even knowing it really. And the cliche being listening to Radio Luxembourg under the bed sheets, which I absolutely did in mid to late 80s. It's a late night presenter called Bob Stewart. Amazing, warm voice, lovely American accent. and there was something a bit naughty. It was probably through being in the teens, but it was something a bit naughty about being in bed, listening under the covers to content that might have been, well, felt a bit naughty at the time, but was probably quite safe by today's standards, to be honest with you. And I think back to that Radio Luxembourg lineup. So I'd probably pluck Bob Stewart out of that.
Okay, back to the career. So you did 3 years at Stratford, approximately.
No, so I was there from 96 till 2003. I think that's right. I was there 9 years, 2005, beg your pardon. I was there for 9 years in all.
So then you went back to re-establish Coventry and Warwickshire, which Untitled Chapter had abolished.
That's right, yes. By a quick 18 months or so at another commercial station in Worcester, which was equally character building. I'll quickly tell you about this. It was a porter cabin situated next to the medium wave transmitter, because it was just on medium wave, and it was a porter cabin situated next to the transmitter. I presented the breakfast show and ran programming there. My first job was to open up the gate to the car park, which ran onto a country lane. And on the first day I said, why do I have to open the gate and close it again? He said, well, because the farmer will bring the sheep down the track at some point during his show, and you don't want them coming into the car park. So, and the toilet block, no word of a lie, was actually in the transmitter as well, in the transmitter shed. So 18 months there or so, it was character building. And yes, to Coventry in 2005. And
were you there to establish it, to help establish it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I joined in May, and the station went live in September. And at the point I joined, there were lots and lots of people joining. So they were in the process of moving out from a very small ground floor office with an upstairs office kind of bolted onto that, to a brand new several £1 million building right in the centre of Coventry, built as a radio station, and an amazing building it was too. Best I've worked in. Really amazing.
I remember it well. You had lots of old people knitting in the foyer.
That's right. Yeah, it was the era of local radio where. That's right. Where there's era of local radio where these what were called open centres were being launched, and there was one in Leicester, nearest to us, and several around north of England as well. And this was to be an open door of the BBC. So, and you'll have seen this, John, yourself several times, that the studios, the side of two of the studios were completely glass panelled. So you could see straight into the presenters presenting. And when I presented from that building, you saw all sorts of things which you may or may not have wanted to have seen. But in terms of being open and being visible, which is what kind of the BBC's ethos for local radio was at the time, it really served a purpose. So yeah, the open centre was, the reception was a corner of that, but there was this amazing space where we ran courses with the local college, and they ranged from anything from how to switch a computer on all the way to doing really complicated video editing as well. It was a really interesting concept. I did a lot of broadcasting from that space as well.
Then Director General Greg Dyke loved it, didn't he? And he would throw money at places like that.
That's right. He was part of the reason I wanted to go back to the BBC, actually. And ironically, I'd not been back many months, and he left. I don't think the two were linked. But his crowning moment that shaped my career was he went on to Coventry and Warwickshire's then breakfast show. They still had their own live breakfast show, apart from being shared with WM the rest of the day, or most of the rest of the day. He went on to the breakfast show, and in that old building, an old tatty building, and said, we're going to bring the radio station back, and was good to his word.
Because actually, I'm told he went to Hereford and Worcester, didn't he, as one of his first places, and he said, if this is local radio, we've got to spend money.
Whether it was Hereford and Worcester, I don't know. You may know better than me on that. He certainly saw that Coventry building and was surprised by even what he saw. But I suppose to give you a bit of context in that is that it was just one room. The news was read from the middle of that room, and if the doorbell rang halfway through your news bulletin, well, so be it. You just the person had to unfortunately wait at the door, or I think you had to get on the intercom during a clip or something like that and say, "Hello, just reading the news. I'll be with you in just one moment." And I think Greg Dyke had a not dissimilar experience to that.
So was Coventry and Warwickshire a success?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, it's just rebranded to its original name from the 90s of BBC CWR, Coventry and Warwickshire Radio. Absolutely a success. I always thought that the fortunes of the station hung largely on the fortunes or otherwise of the football club. But there's an example in Coventry City's case of a club absolutely embedded within its city. You know, at whatever level it plays at, even if it was playing in the old Division 1 or the Premier League. You know, it's audience, its crowds were drawn largely from Coventry. It wasn't a Manchester United or a Liverpool that was drawing fans from all over the country and all over the world. It was very much rooted, and still is, in its community, albeit that the home games are being played down the road in Birmingham at the moment, or were before coronavirus. So yeah, absolutely a success. As I say, being able to reflect some of the successes and hold to account where we could some of the decisions that were being made around the football club and around the city as well. And City of Culture coming up will be a really interesting time for the city.
But surely, in audience terms, you've been whooped by Mercia and now by Free Radio, weren't you?
Yeah, I mean, Mercia was a heritage brand, and as was the case in Worcester, for example, as well. Hereford and Worcester, when I was there, always struggled against Radio Wyvern. Those heritage commercial radio brands that had a foothold in their communities were really difficult opponents to take on. So yeah, Coventry and Warwickshire absolutely was beaten by Mercia. Haven't looked recently actually about how it's comparing to Free Radio. I think personally, only a personal opinion, but the point at which those names vanished around the radio market to become Free Radio. So Beacon in Shropshire and in Wolverhampton, Wyvern in Worcestershire and Herefordshire, and Mercia in Coventry. It's always then a difficult act to follow. Just my personal opinion.
They destroyed local brands essentially, didn't they, by calling it Free Radio?
Yeah, and I get it. When the concept of local brands was first explained to me, and I forget which station or group it was relating it to, it's of its time really. The concept of headed paper was mentioned, and it said, let's say you're setting up a brand called Desk FM. So rather than having had to print 5 loads of headed paper for 5 different radio brands and compliment slips and car stickers and all the things that it might be in advertising, that actually you create this thing called Desk FM and you only have to do that once. And at that point, I totally got the concept behind that. The problem is people identify local radio with those names. And very early on in my career, as mentioned, I was answering the phones at Hereford and Worcester from very early on in my radio career. People always used to say, "Is that Wyvern?" And I go, no, it's BBC Hereford and Worcester. Do you want the Wyvern number? Oh, no, it's for the competition. All right, yeah. And so, and they would be listening to that station, to Hereford and Worcester, and it would be listening to that competition and to that presenter, but they still thought it was Wyvern because it was local radio in Worcester. And people identified with those names and those brands.
We're getting a bit radio nerdy here.
Anytime.
Your Stratford radio then joined up with Steve Orchard, and that's now in a barn just outside Coventry, just outside Warwick, isn't it? 6 radio stations in one building. Well,
if I can paraphrase Star Trek, it's worse than that. So that group, so the station was called The Bear in Stratford. They became part of a group of radio stations called Touch FM, as you say, programmed and presented from a barn just outside Kenilworth in Warwickshire. Late last year, they entered into a licensing agreement with Global. So on all of those frequencies where those local radio brands once existed, they broadcast, I think almost exclusively, they broadcast Capital from London, with the exception of they have to do 1 live program per day, and that's the latter part of the day. Drive time program has to still be done. So there are still programs coming from that barn in Kenilworth, but all under the guise of Capital now.
Why and where did local commercial radio lose the plot?
I'm not sure it did. I think the market fundamentally changed around it. So if I think back to a bit of radio terminology, but I think back to that station at the Bear in Stratford in the late 90s, we got up to about 28% reach, which was, for those that don't know, that was about 28% of all the adults aged 15 plus listening in that area at some point during the week. Our neighbours Fox up the road, Fox FM, which loads of people I'm sure would be familiar with, were doing 40% reach. Now, amazing times, but if you think back to 96, what was on the radio? Radio 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 Live was up and running, I think, by that point. No DAB, no streaming services, and a commercial station up the road in Mercia, which again wasn't really interested in the furthest flung parts of its patch, similarly with Wyvern in Worcester as well. So they were almost happy to leave Stratford and available to us, really. If you think now to the streaming services, to even if you tune in a DAB radio, wherever you happen to be, how many stations will crop up. I think on my presets in my car, I'm up to about 30 now across long wave for Radio 4 for cricket commentary, across medium wave, across FM and DAB, and presets up to about 30, and that's nowhere near the capacity. I could go even further. So I don't think radio ever did lose the plot. I think that the market fundamentally changed, and then you've got streaming service. We've only got one pair of ears. We only really listen to one thing at a time. So the market fundamentally
around
changed.
the corner from you, your local commercial, Jack FM, has 4 employees, and how much live stuff they do per day?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of commercial radio, and I won't deny I'm a real fan of Jack. Their sales director for the group is married to our breakfast newsreader. I'm constantly trying to get the latest gossip from her about what's happening at Jack and what they're thinking, what they're plotting. I don't manage to get too much detail out of her. They're really clever, and their use of technology is a shining example for the rest of the radio industry. The fact that they can do a breakfast show. So there's a link between them and Absolute Radio. And for those that listen to Absolute Radio, they have decade stations, so all the way back from 2000s now, I think, and even 2020s. But they can be playing a different song on several different frequencies across FM or DAB, and then at the point at which the presenter presents, then they'll all hear the same thing, and then each station will go its own different way. And Jack are doing that too, and that was technology pioneered by the people behind Jack, and I'm a huge fan, and often I've talked about them in some of our staff meetings as a great example of you can do personality in anything.
Are they profitable, Jack?
Are they profitable?
Yes.
I don't know. I'm afraid I haven't managed to see their budgets, as far as I'm aware, because they're still going. And it being commercial radio, if they weren't, they wouldn't be going and expanding to where they are with national brands as well.
How many live minutes they do per day? I mean, the news isn't.
You would have to ask them. I think their live program. I think so. Hey, we're live on Zoom. I'm about to say, please don't quote me on this. Don't take this as gospel truth. But I think their live program is 6 till 10, Monday to Friday, and the rest they're making the use of really clever use of technology. Yeah. Okay.
Just local TV. Whatever happened to Oxford TV? Because that used to be where Jack is.
So that's Oxford.
Yes, but there was Jeremy Hunt had a you notice how I hesitated before pronouncing his surname there. He had a franchise for Oxford TV. What happened to that?
I'm afraid I'm going to have to confess, John, put my hands up and say it's before my time in the city. I'm still a relative newcomer, having only been in the city 4 years. So kind of the history and the heritage of media in the city, I'm afraid, is a bit of a lost bit of knowledge on me, I'm afraid. But I mean, that's Oxfordshire still going, isn't it, from Abingdon and Hampden and Whitney College, and doing a really good job on that on Freeview.
Right. And from Common Walks down to Cornwall to work for Leo down there.
That's right.
Station manager. What were you there?
Yep, station manager for 3 months. And if you're going to pick 3 months to be in Cornwall where you want the sunshine and it to be nice and warm, to feel like the Cornwall that we all know and love, probably February isn't the right time to arrive down there. Yes. March was slightly better and April was glorious. This was 4 years ago, back in 2016. So I was there for 3 months. Running the station while the editor there was doing a project. In fact, we almost swapped places. She was doing a project in Birmingham, and I moved down to Cornwall for 3 months to just to keep an eye out for the station and just keep things ticking over down there.
But it was a tiny station, surely.
I mean, one of the smaller BBC local radio stations, yeah. But again, go back to launching a station in a commercial station in Stratford with 8 people. There were still 25, 30 people involved across a week in the station. So yeah, a smaller team than say that you'd find at Radio Manchester or Radio Merseyside or obviously Radio London. But still, a decent sized team and doing a really, really good job.
And then here to Oxford, I mean, what was it attracted you to the Radio Oxford job? It sounds like a BBC board, doesn't it?
Yes. Why did you apply for this job? So that one's somewhere around here I've got my notes from that interview, so maybe I should dig them out.
No.
I was
don't bullshit. Be honest.
Well, look, the job was available at the time, and I'm not saying I would have gone for any job at all, actually. So, living too far north or too far south has never really massively appealed. So actually the geography was right. I've still got family in Warwickshire and Surrey, so actually kind of fitting very nicely in between them. An area I knew just a little bit about, but not loads at all. And I wouldn't even pretend to be an expert in that now, either, to be honest with you, because I'm still learning. We all are.
Did you walk in and change a lot? Did you? I mean, how do you go about doing it?
No, my first day coincided with the first day of training for basically brand new studios and new editing software, which might not sound very much, but if you think about everything that you do, obviously either goes through those studios or is processed through the editing and playout software. It was a fundamental change to everything that we did at that point. And that was my first day. So my first day coincided with a 3-week, no, must have been more than that, 4 or 5 or 6 week training program to launch that. So my first decision to make was an easy one, was, okay, this is not the time to come in and start talking about changes. Let's just make sure everyone's supported through this change process. It's good actually, because it gave me time to talk to everyone, to get to know everyone, and to get to know the station a bit more as well. And naturally, as part of an interview process, you'll listen out and see what you think to the station. But in the same way, you need more time to be able to listen. So there was that, and there was also the run up to the small issue of a referendum about the EU and Britain's future involvement in that as well. So there were those two massive overhaul of studios and playout software and editing software, and the build up to the referendum as well. So there was enough going on. So to answer your question, no, I didn't go in and change anything straight away.
Did you walk in with a list of people you wanted to get rid of and bring in?
No, because radio being as it is, and TV being as it is, and almost Zoom being what is, you've got to get to know people, to know how they work, whether you can work with them, and how you want to work with them before you even get into how you want that program or that bit of the output to sound. So no, absolutely not. Went in completely open-minded. I knew a bit more about how I wanted the station to sound, but the starting point is always, I think, going into a station is that you work with the team that you inherit, because actually going in and making changes isn't great for a radio audience. Any schedule change that you make as an editor or a program controller, whatever you call your job title, you do it with the full knowledge that you're taking away a listener's favorite presenter and part of their routine, especially around breakfast, but any time of the day. Actually, we build our routines around radio. And whether it's, I know I've got to be out the door by the time this news bulletin comes on, or I've got one, I did at that point, I knew if I wasn't at a certain point in my journey by the time the travel news at 7:45 came on, I knew that I was going to be absolutely stuck by the time I got down to junction 9 of the M40 and hit the A34 going into Oxford. So people set their routines by their radio programs and by their presenters. So any change that you make, you always have in mind that you're changing that person's routine, and you've got to respect the audience when you're thinking about making a change.
So what difference have you made? How is your Radio Oxford different to your predecessors? Bill Heiner's dead, but like that.
Yeah, I mean, Marianne, who I followed into Radio Oxford, is a really good radio programmer. So she was at Radio Berkshire first, and then moved to Radio Oxford to run that team. And I would never obviously do down a fellow BBC colleague or another radio programmer. I think the thing I wanted to bring in more, though, was just the sense of, and really, I suppose it's reflecting how all of BBC local radio is changing as well. And there was a time around the point I left BBC local radio to start with, actually, where it what felt like all news all the time and felt quite relentless in that. And there were stations around the country for whom playing a song, playing someone's favorite piece of music was a bit of a sin. It kind of wasn't really done.
You were saying you're the first man who regarded getting to the end of the show with no records as a triumph.
That's right. Yeah, that was kind of, and he was a quite a light, almost entertainment type phone-in presenter, and it was, yeah, he exactly that. He set out his stall on how few songs he would play. So just to come back to kind of how we've changed as a station and how BBC local radio is a change. Yeah, I'm actually loving music, and being proud of the music he plays is a really important part of that. And actually, do you know what? having some fun on the air is a really important part of it as well. And I don't think now that's any different to ever.
I hadn't listened for a while, I mean, until yesterday. There's quite a lot of music on, isn't there? I mean, much more so than I remember.
Yeah, I mean, if you take Monday to Friday, so this is a limit set by Ofcom, and we by no sense try to go to the limit. But if you take the BBC's service license for its local radio stations, it's 60% speech during a period that runs from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday to Friday. So 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. beg your pardon, Monday to Friday. 60% speech, 40% music, and roughly depends on the duration of the songs. You're talking about 6 songs an hour in the hours in which you are allowed to play music. So again, part of the BBC's service license for local radio is that it has to be 90 minutes of speech at breakfast from 7 a.m. to 8:30. But outside of that, we operate to about a 60-40 mix. There are points where we'll have more speech and a bit less music, and there'll be points where we have a bit more music and a bit less speech. But it's a really important part of what we do.
How do you see your role in the local community, particularly now, and make a difference and so on with the pandemic? What are you doing? Are you, what's the BBC slogan about cementing the? There is a TV slogan, isn't there, about you'll know
bringing us together, bring
Yes.
us closer. Beg your pardon, bring us closer.
Bring us
Yeah, and that's yeah, and it's a BBC-wide strapline, is that, and quite a good one of being a unifying force. So, John, your question was what are we here for? What am I here for?
Particularly in the pandemic.
Mine personally, or Radio Oxford's?
No, the Radio Oxford. No.
Radio Oxford's. We're absolutely here to come back to one of your early questions, John. Actually, is when at the start of all this, when it felt at its most uncertain, and at the start of lockdown, we didn't know what that would be like, and it felt a bit scary, and still does for a lot of people as well. I've never known the number of emails and texts and calls that we were getting. I've never known anything like it. And you mentioned make a difference, so maybe we can talk about that in just a sec. Around the country, we've just marked 500,000 interactions with BBC Local Radio under the Make a Difference umbrella.
Well,
so
I've just written a chapter which said 400,000, so I'll update that. Thank you.
Yes, that's right. It's just gone through the 500,000 mark and still growing as well. It's been a real success story for the BBC as a whole, let alone for BBC Local Radio all the way through. So look, we're here for companionship. We're here for trusted news and information, and that's been the case all the way through. It doesn't stop being the case now. Things, we hear about the new normal and things like that, and potentially depending on what the government announces at the weekend as well, but we'll still be here for trusted news and information. But companionship's a really huge part of that too as well. And sometimes just providing a bit of light relief. And some of the stats around the best performing programs around the BBC, obviously the news has been performing brilliantly. National News and the 6:30 Ops as well have been performing really well with the audiences that have been really valued.
How are your figures doing in the pandemic?
Well, we don't know. I suppose just what I was going to make there, John, is that what there also is the demand for that we see within the figures is light relief, light entertainment. So things like what always gets mentioned is I've just binge watched Race Across the World. That's done really well during the pandemic. Things like the repair shop as well. That light relief, that getting away from it all is really important. And I hope at Radio Oxford we can offer some of that. So just to answer your question about audience figures, we don't know, unfortunately. So because of the way radio listening is gauged, it's done by essentially someone knocking on a door and saying, hello, would you fill in this diary, please? Obviously, during a lockdown, the researchers can't do that. But next week, we'll find out our figures for the 6 months until the mid to the end of March. They haven't managed to go right until the end of March, obviously, because that's when the lockdown started. But it'll be roughly the 6 months until the end of March. But again, what we can do is judge success on, calls, on feedback, on the overwhelming success of Make a Difference, which just started as an umbrella point to say we're here to help. If you want help, call us and we'll try and put you in touch with the people that can help. And that's the success of that, as I mentioned, is growing day by day, not just around Oxford and Oxfordshire, but all over the country.
So before the radio figures come out, you expect your audience to be bigger, do you, than it was?
I would, I would hope every single radar sweep, every single 3 months, that the audience would be growing. And as of the 6 months to December, we were having some of the best figures that we'd had for 6 or more years. So we're going into a really good place. It's difficult, audiences come for different things. So sport is naturally a big audience driver for any BBC local radio station. We're the only station that covers Oxford United home and away. So there'll be a set of the audience that only comes to Radio Oxford for that. Now, while Oxford United aren't playing, it might be, I would really hope they would, but it might be that some of those listeners won't come to Radio Oxford because there's no sport. So if it were to be the same, I wouldn't be, I always hope for increased figures. I always do, because I'm ambitious and I want the very, very best for us. Of course I do. But if it remains the same, I would understand that, because there will be a proportion of the audience that won't come to us. And all the research that's been done around radio listening across the country, so local and national at the moment, is that people are also changing their listening habits. So if you can't get up to go to work in your normal routine, and we're creatures of habit with radio as well, but if you can't get up to go to work in your routine, you'll probably have a lie-in. That probably means your breakfast listening peak, and for all BBC radio this is the case, it's actually after 9 o'clock now, where normally it would be 7:30, 8 o'clock, something like that, because we set our alarms for 7 o'clock, we get up, we switch the radio on, we make our breakfast, and we get in the car. Everything's changing, and everything has changed. So you can't sort of compare the two, really. It's very difficult to compare the two.
What's the big audience in Radio Oxford terms? What's your biggest audience in terms of numbers?
It's breakfast. We're not allowed to publish kind of individual program breakdowns. So we just kind of publish weekly reach. But as I mentioned, we're creatures of habit. So pretty much every radio format will follow. I realize you're probably looking at me backwards, aren't you? So it will grow up till about 7, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock in the morning. That's where you'll find your peak, and it will steadily drop down through the rest of the day, with probably a little bobble kind of late afternoon for people, what we used to call drive time. That's right, yeah. People getting in their cars and coming home from work.
Now, a question's come in. Do you feel you reflect the local community? Do you have enough BAME, that dreadful word, presenters and producers?
I don't think the BBC does as a whole, and I don't think we're exempt from that in the slightest. We launched last year a drive, again, it's a part of a whole local radio thing, for new presenters. We called it's called New Voices. So we spent, it was back in November, a Sunday at the Kassam, doing open auditions basically, and we put the word out there on social media. If you've got something to say, if you ever wanted to present on local radio, come and talk to us. And we gave people a minute to stand in front of a judging panel of 3, and I was delighted to be one of them, and just to talk to us about something. And you don't know from that whether someone's going to become a brilliant radio presenter, but you'll get a sense of, can this person communicate and can this person engage? And from that, we took, I think we had between 70 and 80 people on the day. And we took about 10 forward to a next stage where we gave them a bit of a taste of radio, gave them a look around the station, and talked about ways that they might like to get into radio, maybe through hospital radio or community radio. We then took 10 down to a final stage and came back with 4 who at some point soon, once things return a little bit back to normal, will give their first taste of presenting in radio. And one of them's already doing some work for us behind the scenes as well. All that's part of not sitting in a building in Summertown, in our case, and expecting people to come to us. And to properly answer the question, I think to increase our diversity in all of its forms across the people who work for us, on air and off air, we've got to get out there more. It's just rotten timing because none of us are getting out anywhere at the moment. But long term, we've got to be out there more, finding people who've got great stories to tell, who want to be on the radio, presenting, producing, reading the news, helping behind the scenes, whatever it might be. And we'll do even more of that, yeah.
To ask you a mega question, you may or may not know I edited a book called Is the BBC in Peril? To which the answer is yes. And I'm editing a follow-up called Is the BBC still in peril?
Right.
Is it? Dominic Cummings wants to play whack-a-mole with you.
I will give you my honest answer, and I'm not saying this because the corporation pays me, though I'm delighted though they do. No, I think what coronavirus has showed us is that people, and I don't say this through any sense of arrogance or presumption at all, because the audience could have gone any number of places. But I think what coronavirus has showed us is that people come to the BBC at for the big moments. And there were some really big moments planned around Friday for the VE Day anniversary. There are still some big moments, and those viewing figures will be interesting as well. I think when there are big national moments, and whether that's about a pandemic, a global pandemic, or whether that's about celebrating or Glastonbury, whatever it might be, I think what coronavirus has showed us, though, is that people are still coming to us.
They come home to the BBC.
Yeah. Now, again, I wouldn't say that there aren't challenges. The debate over the license fee is a right one to have. Of course, it is. The opposition from streaming services is a real challenge, but there are no broadcasters in the whole world that aren't facing that same challenge from things like streaming services, from on-demand TV. It's about, though, the BBC and all those other broadcasters being able to adapt what it offers to be in line with where the world is right now. But no, I genuinely don't think the BBC is in peril.
You don't really? You don't think that Dominic Cummings has got you in his sights and is not going to let go of you?
I think there's a debate to be had about the over 75s license fees. There's a debate to be had over the future of the future level of the license fee, what it is fair to charge for what the BBC offers. But I'm a license fee payer as well as someone who benefits through being paid through the license fee. I think part of what we also need to explain across the BBC is that it's not just paying for the notion of a TV license that pays for you to have a black and white or a color set probably feels a bit older now than it did 20, 30 years ago. But actually that license fee is paying for the whole lot, including iPlayer and its huge reach, global news, the news channel, all the terrestrial TV services, and local radio as well.
Tim, it's paying for too much. Maybe the BBC has overstretched itself as like an amoeba. Maybe it needs to pull in some of the tentacles.
I think it's again. I think that's the argument about the scope of the BBC. Thankfully, there are others paid way better than me to be having those conversations. I think the BBC is now already more tightly focused than it has been previously.
Now we're coming towards the end. You've never gone to network radio. Is that a deliberate decision?
I think in my formative years, in my 20s,
Did you ever try?
And late teen. Sorry, say again.
Did you ever try to go to network radio?
No, I didn't. I had a look around Radio 1 when it was in the old Egton House, which was on the right-hand side of Broadcasting House. You look at it, and was completely starstruck. And probably in the last year or so, I had a look around Radio 1 on the Peel wing of New Broadcasting House and was similarly starstruck. I think in my teens and 20s, the prospect of working in London never really appealed. And of course, everything was in London before kind of the move out to Salford in the case of 5 Live and Sport. So no, I think kind of local broadcasting has always been where it's at. I probably learned fairly on in my presenting career that I wasn't good enough to follow in the footsteps of those great names that I mentioned earlier on and become a national broadcaster. So it's somewhere about kind of knowing your skills and applying them accordingly. And
never into TV, never been tempted by the glitzy lights of television?
I love watching TV, but it's, as a medium, it's I'll be honest, I don't have the passion for it in the way that I do for radio, of that ability that if something happens right away, you can be on air and telling someone about it and then talking to someone about it and asking a listener what they think about it and having a conversation. The immediacy, and as I mentioned earlier on, the companionship that radio offers is unrivaled in my mind. And
Sky can do that. Sky News is pretty immediate. Can be pretty immediate.
Yeah, but there's something about, though, that radio as the medium. So when I first joined commercial radio, what was the CRCA, the Commercial Radio Companies Association, had an ad, and it's always stuck with me. And this was about why you should advertise on commercial radio. And it had, forgive me, it's quite a long time ago now, but in sketch form, it had someone trying to take their TV into the shower in the morning. And in sketch form, it had someone trying to take their newspaper onto their daily commute. They were driving, obviously, rather than being on the bus. You get the idea. Radio, and I think the phrase actually was, radio is with you everywhere. And I don't think there's any other medium that can do that.
A very last question. How would you like to be remembered when you move on from Radio Oxford, which could be next year, could be 10 years time.
If I said anything,
What's your professional plot going to be?
if I've said anything too terrible, it could be sooner rather than later. I don't think I have. I just hope that that Radio Oxford feels like a fun place to be, that is connected with the community that it's here to serve.
And you think you will have achieved that?
I will never say whether I'm at Radio Oxford for 5, 10, 15 or another 50 years. We'll always keep striving to do it. You're never absolutely perfect. You have to keep striving to get better, because if you're not, then I think it's back to respect for the audience again, that you shouldn't ever settle on what you've got. You should always keep trying to improve.
Now this has gone out on YouTube and it'll be recorded as well, so it'll be picked up as well. So you might get a bit of feedback or foldback or even throwback from this, just to warn you. But thank you very much indeed, and enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your pandemic, which is going to be a long time, I'm afraid. That's it. Thank you very much, Tim. Just to say, next week we've got Innes Smythe, who's going to talk about working for Oxfam and others all around the world. And the week after that, a new thing, which is a town hall where people imagine Jericho in 5 years' time, and they can the 4, 5, 6 people talking about what their dreams for Jericho. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.